William Randolph Hearst was born in San Francisco, California in 1863 and passed his childhood years there in the rarefied atmosphere of the affluent. As a child, he no doubt heard stories about the new town of Sausalito, California, and possibly even met Charles Harrison or Maurice Dorr, who knew his father, the miner George Hearst. After a 3-year stint at Harvard University from 1885 to 1888, when he was expelled for his incessant pranks such as gifting professors chamber pots with their names on the bottoms and his failing grades, William worked for 2 years at the New York World, his father's newspaper, which would become a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party. He convinced his father to let him run this newspaper, and his father saw little point in refusing his only child. He never thought the New York World would make any money, and he was busy with his first senatorial race. William Randolph Hearst's attitude towards others comes through in his letters from Harvard to his mother. He had no qualms buying off Harvard buddies with booze and parties. He called his customers nincompoops. In Hearst, we see the emergence of the elitist American liberal figure. A rich boy with daddy's money who could care less about the people around him and instead saw opportunities to get rich and richer. Hearst returned to San Francisco in 1887 in complete control of the San Francisco Examiner, another of his father's newspapers. Before long, he was dazzling the journalistic world with his transformation of the sickly Examiner into the monarch of the dailies. He devoted nearly a third of newspaper space to gripping stories about true crime. He advocated for the illustration as a method to convey storylines. He publicized circulation numbers on the masthead. He slept 5 hours a night and pored over Pulitzer's papers, intent on beating the fellow newspaperman with scoops. He employed female journalists to go undercover into mental asylums, dropping belladonna into their eyes to get in. His mother, Phoebe, had convinced him to break off his engagement to actress Eleanor Calhoun, whose father was also a California miner. Calhoun would go on to marry Serbian royalty and become a princess. Part of the cash offer Phoebe offered to break the engagement included the fastest speedboat in California at the time for her son. Hearst took it on a trip to Hawaii with buddies after the forced breakup of his engagement to Calhoun. When the 23-year-old Hearst rented a house in Sausalito overlooking the yacht club, it caused little stir among the British colony. He was just another millionaire's son, not the first or the last to seek refuge in Sausalito. Tall, blonde, and slender, with a voice remembered like violets, Hearst was shy in manner but possessed a strong will. His mistress from Harvard days, Tessie Powers, was soon ensconced in his Sausalito bachelor house, much to the chagrin of his mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst. There are no known photos of Powers, and we don't know what she looked like. If you find a photo, you may have discovered a small fortune. We know Tessie was a waitress in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she lived and kept quarters by Hearst when he was at Harvard. We know such a double life was not uncommon among Harvard society. But Hearst went a step further and treated Powers like his public girlfriend, inviting her to dinners and the theater. This was partly due to his natural rebellion against Harvard. He was one of a handful of California boys when most of the students came from the East Coast, and he felt it. But it was also due to a lack of discipline in his life. His father was rarely around, tending to his many business ventures and mines, and his mother enjoyed going on European trips and hiking. Sausalito society remained aloof from Hearst and his San Francisco friends. He was not invited to join the yacht club, and Tessie was ignored on the streets. It was not so much that Hearst kept a mistress, but that he made no effort to conceal it and was outwardly indifferent to criticism. In any case, the energetic Hearst had little time for Sausalito's social protocol. He had become fascinated by photography and was determined to perfect the process of reproducing photographs in newspapers. In 1887, Henry Cartans, a local distiller, built a magnificent home on a promontory near Hearst's rental house. Sea Point, as Cartans called it, appealed to Hearst, and he leased it with an option to buy. Hearst had the entire second floor of Sea Point converted into a photographic studio, complete with darkroom. Tessie Powers was also installed in the new quarters. Through a family-owned firm, the Piedmont Land and Cattle Company, which I believe has become the Piedmont Land and Timber Company, Hearst bought Sea Point and gradually all the other lots around it, in effect isolating himself from his Sausalito neighbors. Since early childhood, when he first saw the palaces and museums of Europe on his first European tour, Hearst had dreamed of possessing a luxurious castle filled with the finest art and sculpture in the world. His mother remarked on his collection abilities and how he would seek items in gift shops as a child. This would become a lifelong obsession. In April 1890, construction began just below Sea Point on what was to be Hearst's castle, the first of many attempts, 5 in total, to give form to a vision. But for reasons not entirely clear, work was stopped with only a retaining wall on Water Street and the foundations of the gatehouse completed. In 1891, Hearst left for an extended tour of Europe and Egypt with Tessie Powers and his comrade in photography, George Pancoast. When he returned, Phoebe Hearst finally had heard enough about Tessie Powers and her hold over her only son. She persuaded Tessie to leave with the promise never to return. Hearst was heartbroken, but obedient to his mother's wishes. His response to these domestic and public defeats was to move out of Sea Point. What was Phoebe Hearst's persuasion? In 2004, a strange document came up for auction at Bonham's. This manuscript document, 5 pages and a legal folio, was found in New York from 1893 and was a draft of the agreement between Phoebe Hearst and Tessie Powers for Powers to cease her relationship with William Randolph Hearst. The pages were creased and toned, bound together at upper margins with brands. Together with an unsigned copy of an 1893 general release form between Tessie Powers and W.R. Hearst, plus a second release form, possibly unrelated. As has been said, while an undergraduate at Harvard, Hearst began keeping company with Tessie Powers. The two frequently appeared in public together, and he took Powers with him on vacation and to football games, defying convention and infuriating his mother. Phoebe succeeded in sending Tessie away in the summer of 1888, but she returned at Hearst's bidding that fall and lived with him for another 5 years. In 1893, Hearst wished to buy a New York City paper, but hadn't the funds himself to do so. He needed a gift or a loan from his mother, which he would not get as long as he kept Tessie. This was a constant theme in Hearst's life. Most of his money belonged to his parents, even into his 20s and 30s. Phoebe continued to rail away at Tessie, at first threatening criminal action and then offering her money, which in 1893 Tessie accepted. This document is an early draft of the agreement reached between the two women. It reads in part, "This agreement made this day of blank between T.M. Powers of Charleston, Massachusetts, part of the first part, and Phoebe A. Hearst of San Francisco, party of the second part. Witnessed, whereas meretricious or vulgar relations have heretofore existed between William R. Hearst of San Francisco, aforesaid son of the party of the second part, and the above-named party of the first part, which said relations have been terminated. And whereas the part of the second part desires that said relations shall not be resumed, and that the party of the first part and said William R. Hearst shall hereafter for all time be as strangers each to the other. Now therefore the party of the first part, in consideration of the payments heretofore made in contemplation, and as a part of this agreement, and hereinafter agreed to be made by the party of the second part, hereby promises and agrees and solemnly pledges herself upon her sacred honor, so far as shall be within her power, to hold no communication or intercourse of any kind whatsoever, either personal or by written or telegraphic correspondence, verbal or otherwise, with the said William R. Hearst during the term of her natural life, to avoid him, to refuse to see him if sought by him, and in every way possible to thwart and render abortive any and all efforts or attempts upon his part or upon the part of any one else in his behalf to cause any intercourse or communication of any kind whatsoever between him and the party of the first part, in consideration of the full and faithful performance of all the promises and agreements hereabove set forth, but the party of the first part, the party of the second part, agrees to pay to the party of the first part the sum of $50,000. This sum is $1.7 million today. I tried to find evidence of Powers after this settlement and found she may have moved to Chicago where she died, but could not find anything definitive. This treatment of Tessie likely influenced Hearst's dedication to his future mistress, Marion Davies. Despite his liberal attitude, Hearst's profile is one many conservatives can look to. He was powerful, charismatic, doubled down in the face of conflict, never conceded or got a fall guy, his own mother, to concede, maintained frame, and was a good-looking man with many children. In 1910, Hearst returned briefly to Sausalito. With a wife, the New York chorus girl Millicent Veronica Wilson, 2 children, and a New York architect in tow, he announced plans for an elaborate $250,000 Spanish-style home on his Sausalito property. Again, he was distracted, maybe by memories of Tessie, and nothing was built. And when Hearst had Sea Point demolished in 1922, Sausalito thought it had heard the last of him. But in the 1930s, when the city's proposed zoning ordinance listed the Hearst property as residential, he stepped forward with plans for a luxury hotel on Bridgeway that would rise to the crest where Sea Point once had stood, and for a cluster of apartments along Atwood Avenue. The city council accommodated Hearst by extending the commercial zone along Bridgeway to North Street, but no project was forthcoming. By 1943, with 5 castles, including San Simeon, William Randolph Hearst surrendered his dream of a Sausalito palace. And the Sunoco Land and Packing Company, a Hearst enterprise, sold his promontory overlooking the bay.